We'll continue now with the second of our 5 points of outline with number 2, the relevance of the Targumistic style of writing in the 1st century AD. We have noticed facts, but now we begin the explanation, the theory to be justified. And what is the theory? The importance of context. That if we want to understand a text from 2,000 years ago, we need to go back to that 1st century AD and the Targumistic style that was being developed at that time. So context is what is so important in methodology. Now, who was it in those days, 2,000 years ago, that has this style in the case of parallel texts that are telling the same story? 1, to shorten the overall length of the text, and then 2, to expand the text within that selection that was made, and to do so with the aim of dramatizing. Is there a theory available to explain this that's supported by the facts? So the theory is there is a Jewish solution to the synoptic problem. If we look at Mark in his own literary context at the time of the development of the Targums. Now, what's a Targum? Oxford Dictionary says a noun, an ancient Aramaic paraphrase or interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, of the type made from about the 1st century AD, when Hebrew was declining as a spoken language. Britannica defines Targum as Aramaic word for translation or interpretation, and it can refer to any of several translations of the Hebrew Bible or portions of it into the Aramaic language. Now, the word originally indicated a translation of the Old Testament into any language, but later came to refer specifically to an Aramaic translation, such as the Targum Onkelos, Targum Jonathan, both written around 100 AD, but the earliest manuscripts are from some 600-700 years later in the 7th century AD, whereas the Gospel of Mark, just slightly earlier than Onkelos, was written in the 1st century, and the earliest manuscripts are from the 4th century. Context, they're less than 50 years apart. Mark in the 1st century, just barely a predecessor of Targum Onkelos in the early 2nd century. Now, the point about them that's identical, that Mark and Onkelos are both retelling events that were written in a Semitic language. Why are they different? Because Onkelos is retelling in Aramaic a story that was in Hebrew, and Mark is retelling in Greek, but in a special Greek document that was based on Hebrew. So there's overlapping context when we consider these Jewish authors and even others earlier than Onkelos who are partly contemporaneous with Mark himself. Philo from 20 BC to 40 AD, Josephus from 40 AD to 100 AD, and Mark demonstrates striking similarity, even in style of writing, with these fellow Jewish writers of the time. So we just consider Philo, who rewrites the biblical Hebrew Balaam story. Josephus, who rewrites the biblical Hebrew Jonah story. And what was typical of their style? They selected a limited amount of material and retold it with the aim of dramatizing it with word effects designed to attract and maintain excitement. As we already talked about Luke using the word "and" immediately 1 time, but Mark uses it 42 times. He speeds up, he's excited. deliberately rewording of the materials by flipping the known order of the words, just reversing two words or reversing two sentences or even reversing two paragraphs, all to attract attention. And then expanding by adding new material versus by way of pickups of known expressions, in this case, Pauline letters, because of familiarity during the months during which Mark traveled together with Paul. So, these are some facts to be noted and weighed in order to answer the question, which writer is adapting whom and for what purpose? And we've looked at facts like the percentages of the shared and unshared materials in each gospel, the word counts of shared and unshared materials. And we've come up with a claim that the Jewish Targumist style of retelling stories is the best candidate for an explanation of observable facts of 1, the percentages of words in duplicated stories, and 2, the word count differences in the parallels. So now we'll move to the third point of our 5 points, the significance of Hebraisms in Greek. Greek texts that show evidences of Hebrew influence. The significance of Hebraisms in the Greek texts of the Gospels. The Hebrew factor enters the scene. And here we consider 2 men, Dr. Robert Lindsay, an American, a Baptist pastor in Jerusalem, and Dr. David Flusser, a Czechoslovakian Jew, who was a classical philologist of Greek. And here are the pictures from left to right of Lindsay and Flusser, accompanied by David Bevan, who has been producing the Jerusalem perspective for decades already, showing some of the findings of what we call ourselves the Jerusalem School, and Professor Safrai of the Hebrew University. Bob Lindsay, all he wanted to do was provide a Hebrew New Testament for the Hebrew speakers in his congregation. So he starts to translate Mark from Greek into Hebrew. So why did he start with Mark? Well, since the 1830s, we've been taught that Mark is the first gospel, the shortest and the first, and the others expanded. So David Flusser, what's his interest? As a philologist of classical Greek literature who had immigrated to Israel, Flusser wanted to read everything that had been written in Greek by Jews, and so he reads the New Testament, and he senses the Hebraic character of Luke's Greek. Now, they were both concerned with facts, publicly observable facts, as they relate, and here's a new term that I've created, Hebrew-ese. What's Hebrew-ese? A new expression that refers to the ease of translating a Greek text into Hebrew. And this happens when the translator gets a suspicion that he's making a translation from Greek into Hebrew of what was originally in a Hebrew text, where the word order and the concepts are more natural in Hebrew than in the Greek text that's being translated. And here are facts, noted by both Lindsay and Flusser. Mark, in these terms of Hebrewese, is erratic. Sometimes he's easy to translate, but sometimes he's difficult to translate into Hebrew. Second point, Luke is consistently easier to translate into Hebrew. And it doesn't make any difference. He's uninfluenced by the presence or absence of the other Gospels. He's just easier, basically, regularly, consistently to be translated from Greek into Hebrew. And third, Matthew is inconsistent because in passages that he has together with Luke, he's easy to translate. But if Mark has the same story, then Matthew becomes as erratic as Mark. So what's the theory hit on by Lindsay? Mark is responsible for this change in Matthew. Matthew is following Mark's wording, and he's also following Mark's story order, but Luke this is the eureka, is independent. He's unaffected in his wording. Whether Mark or Matthew have the story, he is easier to translate into Hebrew than they are, whether they have the story or not. Now, this is an unintentional, accidental discovery made in common by a translator, Lindsay, and a philologist, Flusser. Luke is independent. And this realization makes the most sense of the facts faced by a translator and a philologist. So a group of us who are students of Lindsay and Flusser called ourselves the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Research, JSSR. And here's the theory. A Hebrew Matthew is first and was roughly translated into Hebraic Greek. And then in a linear sequence, Luke was used by Mark, and Mark was used by Matthew, using this Greek translation of a Hebrew base. And here's the schematica of a Hebrew biography of Jesus, a rough Greek translation with Hebrewisms in it, used in turn by Luke, Mark, and Matthew. Now, there's actually historical backing for this statement. Eusebius, in the 4th century, the father of church history, ecclesiastical history, it was the name of his book, Book 3, Chapter 39, he quotes Papias, who lived in the 2nd century. And here's what he says about Papias. He says that Papias said, concerning Matthew, he writes as follows. Papias said, Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So here again, we have a testimony from an early church father, quoting an even earlier church father, that there was a Hebrew account of Jesus. And then the theory that's being proclaimed now is the order in sequence, Luke, Mark, Matthew. So that's the theory. But let's go back to publicly observable facts. And so here we're on point 4, the possibility of statistical proof. Is it possible to use statistics to give evidence, hard, publicly observable evidence, proof of a theory? So we're going to look at facts now that anybody can determine who's ready to make the effort. Facts that will be observed and then weighed in terms of relevance to the question, which writer is adapting which other writer and for what purpose? And here's a chart where you have the word counts of the different parts of each gospel. The one that's against the gray wall is Matthew, where you see a word count in white. That's stories that he has that nobody else has. If it's in yellow, it's what he and Mark share. If it's in green, it's what he and Luke share. And if it's in red, it's what they all three share. So this summary chart makes a bold claim as to have been made for the first time in history of synoptic research. And here again, each gospel is divided into 5 parts. White, independent, red, all 3, and then shared by 2 gospels, but not the 3rd, and these orange and yellow and green coatings, as we saw. So the reason for this discovery being first is that the present theories have prevented anybody else from hitting on the idea that they should bother to count words with such minute detail of attention. They didn't think that anything relevant in support of their theories could be found, and they were right to think so because their other theories are threatened by this hard evidence. So let's look even more closely at verbal identities between parallel texts. What is the relevance, if any, of the study of the verbal identities between the parallel texts? Who's using whom? What's the relation of verbal identities to the issue of potential statistical proof of the order of dependency? Now we got a problem, how to measure such a thing. Percentages of verbal identity. How can you count words that exist in common in two or more documents? How to move from simple existence of common words to any possible significance of these lists? Is it possible to draw any conclusions in terms of direction of dependence between the two documents being compared? Which author is dependent on the other? Now, if two authors are telling the same story, they'll naturally be using many of the same words. So how can common words have any significance in terms of who's dependent on whom? Well, we're helped by Swiss precision. Robert Morgenthaler, New Testament scholar, has written a statistical synopsis with tremendous patience in counting words. And it's written in German, so it's called FFI in English, Form und Folge identisch. And I've abbreviated that into English as IFS, identical in form and sequence. Now, what's that? If there are common words, just a single word, it's not counted at all. It's just there because they're speaking about a common subject. But number one, if two or more identical words, follow each other, and secondly, they occur in the identical order, only then were they counted. Morgenthaler discovered that anywhere from 2-word sequences to 13-word sequences can be found, where you have not only the identical word form, but in the identical order. And that this would be a clue, because we realize, it should be clear, the likelihood of this happening by chance, just because of a similar topic, is highly unlikely. It's more likely that one is dependent on the other, when you can get whole strings of identical words in identical sequence, but in which direction is the dependency? So here's our hypothesis. Statistical proof of direction of dependence is possible. Hard evidence of publicly available, reproducible facts are available, thanks to Morgenthaler. So we'll take a look at those green columns of Matthew and Luke. Now, when we consider this linear sequence, Luke, Matthew, it turns out that 50% of Lucan wording survives in Matthew. Now, the word order of the stories in Luke and Matthew is very different. There's a rather radically different location of the stories, as you can see in this chart, with Matthew on the left and Luke on the right. But let's go on and look at the yellow columns comparing Mark and Matthew. They're in the middle of this chart. And we find out that 50% of the Markan wording has survived in Matthew. Now we look at the red columns. That means word counts in stories that they all three are telling. We see that Mark is longer than either Matthew or Luke. And when we look at the word counts between Mark and Matthew, 50% of the Markan wording has survived in Matthew. But even inside of triple tradition, if we compare those stories that were all read, and we leave Luke out of it and just compare Mark and Matthew, here also, Matthew gets 50% of the Markan wording survives in Matthew. So no previous researcher has ever bothered to count these word relationships inside triple tradition. And why didn't they bother? Because such counting seemed irrelevant to their theories or even potentially threatening. Now just consider this, Matthew's amazing 50% consistency in 3 different situations. If we're trying to check if this theory of linear dependence, of sequence, works or not, we have, if it's Luke and Matthew, 50% of Luke's wording survives in Matthew. If it's Mark and Matthew, 50% of Mark's wording survives in Matthew. And if inside triple tradition even, Matthew managed to get 50% of his wording like the wording in Mark. So Matthew is consistent, not only in terms of the wording of other parallel texts, but he maintains this consistency also in story order. So he's similar to Markan order, and that makes him very different from Luke's order. So here are 90 stories that they all 3 have, triple tradition pericopes, the technical term, and you can see that they're in similar order. There are some of them out of place. But as soon as you get stories shared by Matthew and Luke, the word order is really out of whack in the 63 stories that they tell. They put them in different locations. So what's the legitimate conclusion? This repeated consistency indicates that Matthew is a secondary writer. Over and over again, in each of 3 different pairs of parallels, he maintains the same consistent style of getting 50% of the text in front of him retained within his wordings. And no scholar has previously noted this consistency even within triple tradition. Now, can statistics contribute to proof of linear sequence? Here's a hypothesis again. Is it possible to provide statistical proof of the direction of dependence within a linear sequence of the Gospels? And here's the claim: solid evidence by way of publicly observable, reproducible facts is available. And so here, a new precision in the counting of wording and percentages within triple tradition is what is going to solve this problem for us. And here we notice in the Luke, Mark, Matthew sequence, 32% of Mark's text within triple tradition consists of Lucan wording. So when Mark depends on an earlier text, he doesn't get 50% of it maintained within his text. He makes enough changes so that only 32% of the wording is preserved. Number 2, 50% of Matthew's text within triple tradition is Markan wording that he has preserved. And then when you do the count of words in triple tradition, you find that Matthew's text at the end has only 20% of Lucan wording. Well, what's going on? Because he usually gets 50% of the one that's before him. And these are facts that anybody can reduplicate, but nobody had bothered to count them. So why no one counted these facts is because they appeared to be irrelevant to the dominant theories. The internal facts of the word relationships within triple tradition become especially relevant in terms of checking the theories of linear dependence between the Gospels, such as the Lindsay-Flusser theory of Lucan independence of the others the theory that of our Gospels, Luke was first, followed by Mark, and then by Matthew. Now, these statistics are capable of disproving all 6 options of linear dependence and other theories as well. And tension ran high during the research as to what would be the results. In fact, the statistics did disprove 5 of the 6 theories, by changing the order, not Luke, Mark, Matthew, but switching the order all around. There are 6 different options. 5 of them didn't work. The statistics didn't work. But the Luke, Mark, Matthew sequence was supported. But a sudden, unexpected challenge to this theory came during the research. The research threatened to knock out also the remaining 6th option, our theory of Luke, Mark, Matthew sequence. Now, this seeming failure of confirmation for a linear sequence in the Gospels is by doing some simple calculation that the empirically observable amount of 20% of Lucan wording surviving in Matthew would have predicted 50% of 32% should be 16% of Matthew. According to the theory, only 16% of Matthew in triplet addition should consist of Lucan wording. And again, the whole harsh statistical truth is that not 16, but 20%. Seeming failure. If we start with Luke's text within triplet addition, here are the number 1 facts: that 32% of Luke remains in Mark, and 50% of Mark remains in Matthew. And when we counted, 20% of Luke's text remains in Matthew. But the theory's prediction, according to Luke, Mark, Matthew being in sequence, is that only 16%, because if you take 50% of 32% is 16%, not 20. So if indeed 20% of Lucan wording remains through Mark into Matthew, that would be a failure of the hypothesis. But in the case of the theory of linear dependence, well, I'm just repeating myself, only 16% of Luke's wording should be found, and here's the little calculation. If Mark got 32% of Luke and Matthew got 15% of Mark, that would mean that only 16% of the wording in Matthew should be from Lucan wording left. The result indicated a traumatizing failure, as is obvious from the way I keep repeating in this PowerPoint. So here's the fact: potential destruction of the theory within triplet addition. 20% remains and not 16. But here comes the eureka moment. It has to come through Mark, via Mark, into Matthew. For the statistics to be relevant, they had to be counts of words that survived, Lucan words that survived, through Mark into Matthew. If words got into Luke, from Luke into Matthew in any other way, they're not relevant for the calculation. So it became necessary to eliminate all of these identical informant sequence words that were common to Matthew and Luke, but they weren't found in Mark. And the count revealed that 4% of the Lucan Matthean parallel texts are not found in Mark. And this calculation proved that the theory of linear dependence was correct after all, because it had predicted 16. And if you take out the 4% that are in Luke and Matthew, but are not in Mark, then the ones that came through Mark into Matthew are 16%. Now, the scholarly world is aware of this, that there are agreements between Luke, and Matthew that are a problem for Mark and priority as to their origin. And they've been sidelined as unimportant. They've been called minor agreements. We don't know how they got there. Turns out that they are minor in number, but major in significance, because they clinch the argument for the only one of the 6 options of linear sequence that does survive, and that's Luke, Mark, Matthew. So, this facts of verbal identity within triple tradition of the survival of Lucan words through Mark, and only 16% of Lucan wording is left through Mark, is this surprising fact that the minor agreements are major in significance. They are exactly what establish the Luke, Mark, Matthew linear relationship by this surprising, as it were, perfection of the statistical evidence. So now we come to the 5th point, relevance of external historical context. Why is this important? Because what we've been dealing with, this internal precision of minute, careful word counts, of publicly observable facts within the text, is rather too complex to be grasped easily or immediately. So now we're going to look not at internal context, but external context. Matters of politics and religion of those days 2,000 years ago. And this last step in the argument comes from publicly observable facts in the realm of universally uncontested facts in the external historical context. Now, what could there be 2 facts that the historians don't disagree about? Well, they exist. The incontestable, and therefore nobody has contested them, uncontested, which all agree on, are 2 basic trends. And here they are. Number 1, tension was growing between Jews and Jews, even hatred against Jesus and his followers. And the hatred led to Jesus' crucifixion in the 30s AD. And it was followed by ongoing tension between the Jewish followers of Jesus and the Jewish followers of the Sadducees and Pharisees, most of whom opposed the Messianic Jewish followers of Jesus and martyred some of them. Tension between Jews and Jews. Now, not just tension, outright extreme hatred between Jews and Romans, between the subjugated Jews and the cruel Roman rulers. And this hatred led to rebellion in 66 AD and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. 2 solid facts. Tension and hatred between Jews and Jews, and this second one between Jews and Romans. Now, how are they reflected in the Synoptic Gospels? Now, let's just think, what do the Gospel writers want you, the reader, to feel? We're not asking for content now and facts. We're asking, what did the writer want you to feel about the Romans or about the Judean leaders as groups? And what did they want you to feel about such people as Pilate, the Roman governor, Herod, the Jewish ruler, and Caiaphas, the high priest? Well, if you take a closer look and ask these questions, which gospel is more ironic in its approach to what it's trying to make you feel about these groups and these individuals, and which gospel is more aggressive when it comes to your feeling Jews against Jews and Jews against Romans? The evidence points in a linear progression from a relatively peaceful, ironic Luke to an abrasive Mark to an aggressive Matthew. And so this sequence reflects the order of their composition in terms of exhibiting the growing tensions in the time of Jesus. It would appear that a known chronological progression is being reflected in terms of the ever-growing anti-Roman and anti-Christian sentiments in the context of those days. It would seem logical that the most Irenic is the earliest, and as things got worse, the most aggressive count would be the latest. And one factor that goes along with this sequence of the gospel is pay attention to the opening lines. What are the implications of the differing emphasis of each of these four documents? The opening lines. Context-sensitive quest to find the actual sequence by looking at the open lines. Luke is writing the Acts of Jesus, and later on he writes the Acts of the Apostles. Mark says the good news, the gospel of Jesus. And Matthew gives reference to the genealogy, proof texting, that Jesus is who his followers say he is. And then this more grand theological, philosophical opening that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. So here is this sequence from the opening lines. Luke recording his deeds recorded, the Acts of Jesus. Then, 2, his significance dramatized, the exciting good news, gospel, only one who calls himself a gospel. And 3, Matthew, his heritage being proven, the genealogy is listed first. And then his identity being exalted as to this fantastic significance of the Lord Jesus. So, what do we conclude of having looked at these 5 topics? Highly significant conclusions are made possible by carefully paying attention to the chronology of the Jewish context of the Gospels and exceedingly minute attention to observable facts of the complex interrelationships between the Gospels. First, the importance of understanding Jewish Mark in his own context, first century Roman province of Galilee, Galilea and Judea, nearly 2,000 years ago. Second, Mark's context, which enabled him to use a Targumistic dramatizing writing style as he wants to present exciting good news. Third, internal evidence by looking at these exquisitely minute details when it comes to Hebraisms. 1, internal evidence, and 2, the counts of the word identities in parallel texts that suggest a sequence of the Synoptic Gospels that can be statistically confirmed as being Luke, Mark, Matthew. Fourth, the external historical context, external, of the growing political and religious hatreds of those days is reflected in the Gospels in a way that clinches the sequence, Luke, Mark, Matthew. So just consider the results of this research. 1, independence of Luke as the first in the sequence. 2, dependence of Mark, the early Jewish Targumist, in the middle, with a clear idea of Mark's method of choosing a limited amount of text and then expanding and dramatizing it. 3, the consistency of Matthew's relationship to other texts in several different contexts where he keeps up the same consistency of the wording that he adopts into his text from the prior text. And then, fourthly, claim for a statistical confirmation of the above sequence. Now, what's the value of these discoveries? 1, a believable sequence of the gospel writers which allows the reader to sense and enjoy sensing the reasons of why one writer is editing the other. 2, an understanding of how testimony works and is proven by inconsistencies, which fade in the light of the ring of truth in the general consensus. 3, freedom from the destructive efforts to reduce Jesus to a nice ethical teacher by way of using the inconsistencies to claim wrongly that therefore the texts are unreliable. 4, the opportunity for Christian seminaries, in quotes, Christian, to build faith instead of, as happening in all too many seminaries in the States and Europe, that faith is destroyed. So, devotional afterthought. What does all this mean for what we say that the Bible is inspired Word of God? It gives us the opportunity to follow what the Bible itself claims to be. We see the inconsistencies of human witness, but so Spirit-inspired that it can miraculously and infallibly point to the one and only infallible God. The biblical miracle avoids both the extremes of myth, just cleverly devised stories, and magic, some voice spoke out of heaven and you just copy like Muhammad did, or Joseph Smith and these other religions that have magical theories of inspiration. We avoid those extremes of myth and magic by having the notion of the inspiration of the Bible as being God's miracle, not myth on the one extreme and not magic on the other extreme. May this be a blessing.